Were you relieved to be arrested?
Part of me was, and part of me wasn't.
When the name Jeffrey Dahmer is mentioned, it invokes a sense of dread, horror, and disbelief. Few criminals in history have reached his level of infamy, not just because of the sheer number of his victims, but because of the horrific nature of his crimes. Dahmer was not just a serial killer, he was a necrophile, a cannibal, and a man whose depraved desires led him to commit some of the most heinous acts ever recorded. From the late 1970s to the early 1990s, he lured young men into his lair, murdered them in cold blood, and engaged in unspeakable acts of brutality. He experimented on their bodies, preserved their remains, and even consumed their flesh. For years, he remained undetected, despite multiple run-ins with police. His calm demeanor, ordinary appearance, and ability to manipulate others allowed him to evade suspicion. But when the truth finally came to light, America and the world was left in shock. Who was this man? What created such a monster? And how did he get away with it for so long? This is the full story of Jeffrey Dahmer, who was later known as Milwaukee Cannibal, or the Milwaukee Monster. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. From the outside, it seemed like he had a normal childhood. His father was a chemist and his mother was a homemaker, but behind closed doors, his home was filled with conflict, neglect, and instability. His mother, Joyce, suffered from mental health issues, including depression and addiction to prescription drugs. She often fought with Lionel, who was frequently absent due to work. The home environment was toxic, leaving Jeffrey emotionally isolated. From a young age, Dahmer displayed deeply disturbing tendencies. He became obsessed with death and decay, particularly with dead animals. At just 10 years old, he would collect animal carcasses, dissect them, and store their bones in jars. While other children played sports or video games, young Jeffrey was fascinated by death. By the time Dahmer entered high school, his odd behavior had escalated. He was known for dark pranks and inappropriate jokes, often making disturbing comments about dismemberment and murder. However, because he was humorous at times, his classmates brushed it off as bizarre but harmless. But beneath his odd sense of humor was deep loneliness and a growing darkness. Dahmer began drinking heavily as a teenager, bringing liquor to school and drinking straight from the bottle during class. Teachers and classmates noticed but largely ignored it. At the same time, he realized something else. He was gay. Growing up in a conservative community, he had no one to confide in. His isolation deepened, and his fantasies became increasingly twisted. By the time he graduated from high school in 1978, he was on the verge of committing his first murder. Just weeks after graduating, on June 18, 1978, Dahmer picked up his first victim, 18-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Hicks. Dahmer had lured him to his house with promises of alcohol and conversation. The two drank together, but when Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer panicked. He struck Hicks on the head with a dumbbell, strangled him to death, and then dismembered his body. Rather than being horrified by what he had done, Dahmer felt exhilarated. He had finally acted on his dark desires, and the feeling of total control over another human being intoxicated him. He went ahead and crushed Hicks's bones, dissolved parts of his remains in acid, and disposed of them in the woods. This was the moment when Jeffrey Dahmer fully became a killer. After murdering Hicks, with the help of his father's counseling, Dahmer attempted to live a normal life. He enrolled at Ohio State University in 1978, but his drinking spiraled out of control, and he dropped out after just one semester. His father was disappointed, but in 1979, Dahmer enlisted in the U.S. Army, hoping for discipline and structure. But his alcohol addiction worsened, and he was discharged in 1981 due to poor performance. After bouncing between family members' homes, Dahmer finally moved to Milwaukee in 1982, where he would go on to commit some of the worst evils in American history. When Dahmer arrived in Milwaukee, he worked odd jobs, including at a chocolate factory, while secretly fantasizing about killing again. He would go nearly 9 years without murdering, but his urges never faded. For nearly a decade, Dahmer's murderous urges lay dormant, but in 1987 they exploded back to life with terrifying intensity. Between 1987 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer went on a brutal killing spree, murdering 16 more young men. His method was disturbingly consistent. He would lure his victims, often young, gay men, to his apartment under the guise of offering money, drinks, or photographs. Once inside, he would drug them, strangle them, and then indulge in the most horrific acts imaginable. By 1987, Dahmer targeted his next victim, 24-year-old Stephen Tuomi, whom he killed in a hotel room. But instead of stopping, Dahmer grew more depraved with each murder. He went on and murdered 15 more men. His methods became more twisted, drugging his victims so they couldn't resist, strangling them to death, dismembering their bodies, keeping body parts such as skulls, hearts, and genitalia, and worse of it all, necrophilia and cannibalism, eating their flesh to keep them with him forever. Dahmer even tried turning victims into zombies by injecting acid into their brains while they were still alive. His apartment in Milwaukee, apartment 213, became a house of horrors, filled with decomposing bodies, severed heads, and human skulls stacked in his fridge. Despite multiple police encounters, Dahmer was never caught, until one victim managed to escape. One of the only people who had consistently suspected Dahmer was Glenda Cleveland, a black woman who lived next door. She had repeatedly called the police about him, complaining about the horrible smell, strange noises, and young boys running from his apartment. In May 1991, just 2 months before Dahmer's arrest, Cleveland and her daughter, Sandra, saw a 14-year-old boy, Conarak Synthesomphone, staggering outside Dahmer's apartment, bleeding and naked. They called the police immediately. When officers arrived, Dahmer smooth-talked them, claiming that the boy was his adult lover who had simply had too much to drink. Shockingly, the police believed him and escorted the boy back into Dahmer's apartment. Had they searched his home that night, they would have discovered the remains of another victim lying on the bedroom floor. Instead, they left, and Dahmer murdered Conarak just minutes later. Cleveland never stopped warning people, but she was ignored until it was too late. When the truth came out, the police department faced heavy backlash for their incompetence and racist negligence in ignoring a black woman's warnings. For years, Jeffrey Dahmer's reign of terror had gone unnoticed, despite the horrific stench coming from his apartment and several close calls with law enforcement. However, his luck ran out on the night of July 22, 1991, when one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man, managed to escape. On that fateful night, Dahmer approached Edwards on the streets of Milwaukee, offering him money to pose for nude photographs at his apartment. Lured by the promise of cash, Edwards reluctantly agreed. However, the moment he stepped inside apartment 213, he knew something was terribly wrong. The first thing he noticed was the overpowering stench, a mix of rotting flesh and chemicals. The second thing was the barrels of acid and strange tools scattered across the room. But before he could react, Dahmer had locked the door behind him. At first, Dahmer tried to keep him calm, telling him to just sit and watch The Exorcist 3 with him. But as time passed, Dahmer's behavior became more erratic. He started rocking back and forth, chanting under his breath, and telling Edwards that he was going to eat his heart. When Dahmer briefly let his guard down, Edwards saw an opening. He punched Dahmer in the face, kicked him in the stomach, and ran for his life. Bursting out of the apartment half naked and still in handcuffs, he flagged down 2 police officers, Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller. The officers followed Edwards back to Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer, attempting to stay calm, invited them in and even tried to explain away the handcuffs as a consensual fetish. However, Officer Mueller noticed something unusual, a stack of Polaroid photos on the dresser. When he picked them up, his stomach turned. The photos showed dismembered bodies, severed heads, and naked corpses in disturbing positions. "This is real," Mueller whispered to his partner. Dahmer, realizing he had been caught, tried to fight back, but the officers overpowered him and placed him under arrest. As they continued searching the apartment, what they found was worse than anything they could have imagined. A refrigerator filled with human remains, including severed heads and a heart. A freezer containing muscles, bones, and pieces of flesh. A large blue barrel filled with decomposing body parts submerged in acid. Skulls and skeletons, some painted and kept as trophies. Jars filled with human genitals and preserved organs. A bloody power drill, ropes and sleeping pills, evidence of his gruesome zombie experiments. The officers immediately called for backup. Within hours, the entire world would know the name Jeffrey Dahmer. As news of his crimes spread, America was in shock. The details were so grotesque that many struggled to believe they were real. Jeffrey Dahmer confessed to 17 murders with shocking indifference. He gave detailed, emotionless accounts of how he had drugged, strangled, dismembered, and cannibalized his victims. His trial began in January 1992, and the courtroom was packed with grieving families, horrified spectators, and the media. His defense team argued that he was insane, but the jury rejected this claim. On February 15, 1992, Dahmer was sentenced to 16 life terms, amounting to a total of 957 years in prison. Surprisingly, in prison, Dahmer claimed to have found God. He was baptized in May 1994 and even started reading the Bible regularly. However, many believe that his remorse was an act, a last attempt at redemption. On November 28, 1994, less than 3 years into the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, Dahmer was attacked by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver while cleaning the prison gym. Scarver, who hated Dahmer, later claimed that Dahmer would mock other prisoners by shaping food into body parts and covering it with ketchup to resemble blood. Using a metal bar from a weight machine, Scarver beat Dahmer to death, crushing his skull beyond recognition. Dahmer died instantly. He died as violently as he had lived, his skull shattered, his body left lifeless on the prison floor. Some called it justice, others saw it as an escape from the true punishment he deserved. Dahmer's apartment building at 924 North 25th Street became a morbid attraction after his arrest. Locals feared it would turn into a crime tourism hotspot. So, in 1992, the entire building was demolished. For years, there were debates over what to do with the land. Some wanted a memorial for the victims, while others didn't want anything associated with Dahmer's crimes. Today, the lot remains vacant. There were once talks of turning it into a park, but no official structure has been built. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the most horrifying in American history. His crimes raised chilling questions about human nature, mental illness, and the failures of the justice system. How did he go unnoticed for so long? How many lives could have been saved if law enforcement had acted sooner? Dahmer's crimes exposed police failures, systemic racism, and the terrifying reality that monsters can live among us undetected. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Dahmer's story is the fact that, despite his unimaginable crimes, he seemed eerily normal to those who knew him. He worked regular jobs, had friendly conversations with neighbors, and even managed to charm some of the police officers who encountered him. But his victims were not just names on a list. They were sons, brothers, and friends who deserved better. Their stories must never be forgotten. And so, while the world remembers Jeffrey Dahmer as a cannibalistic killer, the true legacy belongs to those he stole from us, the young men whose lives he ended far too soon. Today, Dahmer's story continues to captivate and terrify the world. Countless documentaries, books, and films have explored his life, each attempting to understand what drove him to commit such monstrous acts. But in the end, the truth remains as disturbing as ever. Jeffrey Dahmer was a real-life nightmare, one whose name will never be forgotten. The world will never forget the name Jeffrey Dahmer, the cannibal who terrified America. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and consider subscribing to get updates on my future stories. Until next time, goodbye.